Hi everyone again. So we've come to the final lecture of this week on the Marie Calloway text. So I'll just get right into it again. So getting into my PowerPoint. So this final little lecture, I want to look at Marie Calloway and her relationship to feminism. So sort of building off the little theoretical text that I asked you guys to read from Emma Young. She's talking about, in a British context, how short stories advance kind of the project of feminism, specifically in the contemporary moment. So the relationship between Marie Calloway and feminism, as this little image I have here suggests, is complicated. So we'll get into these complications. So just looking at Emma Young's book, first of all, so it's just some quotes that I pulled out of it, and I'll just read them. So in part, the prevalence of these collections of short stories is a result of third wavers' preference for defining feminism in their own terms. That is, for each individual feminist to define feminism for herself individually. Third wave feminism's focus on individuality means it addresses the subject's experience of having fragmented and conflicting selves that do not constitute a seamless and coherent whole. Of course, and this is getting into kind of the critique, perhaps, of third wave feminism. Of course, one consequence of this emphasis on individuality and the embracing of embodied politics that aims to provoke change by exercising and resisting power in everyday life is that the movement is frequently criticized for not progressing beyond individual assertions of identity to a larger collective political identity. So that last quote especially kind of gets at some of the problems of linking Calloway's texts with the political project of feminism. It does seem very kind of focused on Calloway as an individual. There are some kind of references to gender, but they are kind of scattered. There's no point at which Calloway just deliberately and kind of obviously enters into a long kind of explanation of her the feminist intent of her work. The relationship between her work and feminism is a little bit ambivalent, and that is being criticized. So certain readers have called these texts feminists, and certain readers have called them not feminist. So this is just one of, in the criticism section of her short story book, there are kind of stories in Calloway's short story book where she relates her experiences doing sex work in the UK, and this woman commenter on her work says, how is she going to feel when all her friends and family find out about her explicit blog about being a hooker in London? I am pro-sex and sex work and everything, but this is not feminism. It's attention whoring, and it's going to blow up in her face when it's no longer cute. So this is kind of a very strong comment that Calloway put in her book, saying that Calloway's work is not feminism. So I just put this here just to show that there is a little bit of disagreement over whether this work is actually feminist or is not feminist. Okay, so let's just look at some of the references to feminism that there are in the text, and we'll see that these references are a little bit obtuse. She references feminism, but her actual perspective on feminism at certain points is not clear. It's very ambiguous. So I'll just read these. These are just quotes from both the stories. I wondered if this is just how men are, no matter how feminist and intelligent. So speaking about the Adrian Brody character, who kind of, she likens him at one point in the story to a 13-year-old boy, even though he's kind of written these sophisticated pieces of cultural criticism, and he seems to have a feminist politics, but as soon as, I don't know, they enter into a sexual encounter, all that kind of goes away, and he enacts, I guess, problematic behaviors, perhaps. Behavior is kind of like going back to Cat Person, that seemed very kind of influenced by pornography. And Adrian Brody actually opens with Calloway connecting to him over this piece of cultural criticism that he's written about pornography. So it's a little bit of hypocrisy that he seems to be critiquing pornography, but also very much enjoying it at the same time. Yeah, and then another quote, I felt strange that here we were two leftist feminists, I guess. And of course, the feeling was that we had this unconventional relationship or way of treating each other. But here and now, when it was pouring down rain, he automatically fell in the role of being a man and shielding me from the rain. So no matter how kind of feminist our politics get, gender kind of creeps always back into the equation. We do kind of enjoy, or some of us, I guess, probably enjoy falling back into these kind of masculine behaviors and feminine behaviors. Not that these need to be eradicated. There's a lot of positive masculine behaviors, and there's a lot of positive, obviously, feminine behaviors. So, but yeah, it is a bit difficult at times to critique gender and at the same time participate in it. And then another quote, I felt uneasy to be suddenly upheld as a feminist writer, which I never thought of myself as, and which seemed like a tremendous burden. So this is in Jeremy Lin. And yeah, this really just shows her ambivalent attitude toward being labeled a feminist writer, the kind of box that would put writing in. Yeah, it's very difficult for a artistic project to have a kind of very obvious political bent to it, because it does kind of limit it sometimes. Me and my friends were talking about how it seems ridiculous to call you a feminist, but you support a lot of female writers through Moo Moo House, and you wrote that article about how female writers are taken less seriously than male ones. Here she's talking to Jeremy Lin again, and yeah, it seems ridiculous to call you a feminist because his behavior is I don't even know how to describe Jeremy Lin. He has these great lines like, I'm only attracted to women that weigh 100 pounds. I can't have crushes on women anymore because I watch too much pornography. Again, that kind of pornography theme entering into the story again. So he doesn't seem like a feminist in his behavior, obviously, but at least on the internet, he can definitely perform the feminist role by writing these pieces of cultural criticism, I guess, that are feminist. And then just the final one, this is from Calloway. I remember that you said that one day you want to write a story that's completely incomprehensible. Sorry, this is from Calloway's friend. I remember that you said that one day you want to write a story that's completely incomprehensible to men, my friend said. I've always been kind of struck by that line, and I wonder if these kind of texts that she's written here are already in that line, perhaps. But this is kind of a very, I think, a kind of revolutionary feminist politics in this little quote, even though it kind of gets passed over. So yeah, so there's a lot of different mentions of feminism here, and they're all a little bit different. So there's no kind of clear perspective in the text about where Calloway stands in relationship to feminism. Okay, so to combat that a little bit, I just wanted to perhaps place Calloway into dialogue or conversation with very prominent feminist theorist of the 1970s, Diane Dworkin, who was kind of one of the more militant feminist theorists of that time, who expressed some of the strongest or more extreme views on gender that are out there. So Calloway, in the interview that I mentioned in the last lecture video, she does say that ever since I was a teen, I had read feminist writers like Dworkin and McKinnon, and the way they wrote about sex work had an enormous impact on me. Was it really as horrible as they said? Is sex work literally the buying and selling of women between men? Is sex work literally rape? So Dworkin and McKinnon, they became prominent through, like what I said, the very extreme views that they expressed toward certain elements of patriarchy, and especially so sex work and pornography. So Dworkin actually was involved in kind of legal battles to ban pornography. And this kind of second wave feminism of Dworkin's has obviously been critiqued and perhaps transcended in third wave feminism, where it is kind of a lot more pro-sex work, and not so much pro-pornography, but definitely not trying to ban pornography, not seeing it in as an extreme light as Dworkin and McKinnon. And then I just have a little quote from Dworkin just to give you some impression of her kind of politics. And this is from Intercourse. How to separate the act of intercourse from the social reality of male power is not clear, especially because it is male power that constructs both the meaning and the current practice of intercourse as such. Is intercourse itself then a basis of or a key to women's continuing social and sexual inequality? So Dworkin kind of understands sexual intercourse as the main means of reproducing kind of gender oppression. And that does sound extreme, but I mean, we saw it in Cat Person, where perhaps the power dynamic of these two characters was originally not balanced, but at least it swayed back and forth a little bit. But as soon as they got to the sexual encounter, the power dynamic was very kind of strongly instantiated as being on the male side. That's where Robert really began to assert his power and reproduce perhaps patriarchy. So, I mean, we see it in Adrian Brody perhaps as well, even though their sexual encounter is a little bit balanced perhaps. I'm curious to how you guys read it. In terms of the power dynamics, I mean, a little bit more balanced, at least compared to Cat Person. There's at least some kind of dialogue. But at the same time, they still kind of reproduce the similar behaviors, where the men are very influenced by pornography, where obviously pornography displays a lot of, although pornography is kind of a diverse field of entertainment, it does display a lot of men kind of being in the primary position of pleasure or power. So it does have a little bit of a corrosive effect on how we view sex. And Dworkin definitely wasn't against sex or anything like that, but she was against sex as it was kind of participated in during her time, and perhaps during our time as well, if Cat Person and Adrian Brody are telling us anything. So Calloway is in a little bit of a dialogue, I think, between her and Dworkin, where there is kind of like that second wave feminist view that the sex that Calloway engages in is not really empowering, in the sense where like third wave feminism did view kind of a lot of sexual activity and women's sexual behaviors as potentially being empowering. But I don't know if you could describe the sexual intercourse in Adrian Brody as empowering, but I'd be interested if perhaps people read it differently. At the same time, she's definitely not in that kind of extremist Dworkin perspective, where she views sex in this totally negative light. Calloway does in other kind of stories participate in sex work, which Dworkin would obviously be against. So there is a little bit of tension. And Calloway kind of situates herself then between second and third wave feminist theories, I think, in a way that is kind of productive. So sort of bringing out the best elements of both. That is interesting. And I did mention this in the intro kind of lecture, but Calloway's short story book also opens with a quote from Kate Millett about how male and female experience are completely different. And there is a little bit in Kate Millett's book that came out in 1970, Sexual Politics. She talks about how, in a kind of similar to Dworkin, that the sexual act is kind of constructed by political context, and that political context is patriarchy. So there's a little bit of a connection there again between Millett and Dworkin and Calloway. So there is a lot of kind of these conversations going on that I think are interesting. Okay, and this is the final kind of question I have for you guys. So just going back to the Emma Young chapter, She kind of talks about endings in there, and particularly how they function differently, perhaps, in women's short stories. So I just have this quote from Young. So she writes, "For Aristotle, the end provides closure, ensures narrative resolution, and in turn ensures compliance with the unity of action." Damon Knight argues that here, if anywhere, the author has a chance to make the reader understand what the whole meaning of the story is, and thus advocates the short story's ending as a moment of closure and revelation. So that is kind of how short story endings typically, or any kind of dramatic artwork kind of typically perhaps function. You guys probably know the term epiphany. That's kind of really common in someone like James Joyce's short stories in The Dubliners, where each of those short stories ends on an epiphany, meaning the protagonist has a revelation, a little flicker of insight. And I don't know if that applies to these two short stories from Calloway. So the question I had is, what did you make of the ending of these two short stories? Is there an epiphany for the protagonist, or alternatively, the reader, which is a different way of perhaps of thinking about epiphany. Epiphany is usually experienced by the protagonist. An epiphany for the reader would be like the reader, as it's kind of constructed or positioned in the text, in some way experiences a bit of insight. So that's the question that I have. I mean, I can kind of give my perspective a little bit, and then maybe we can talk about it in the Discord or in the Zoom session. But basically, I'm really intrigued by the ending of Jeremy Lin. So there's an epiphany there, like the kind of traditional epiphany arrives in that text message from Calloway's friend about how Jeremy Lin views her as a writer and not a sex object. And that's kind of presented as the epiphany. But it's kind of weird for an epiphany to arrive via text message and from another person. And Calloway doesn't really comment on what she thinks of this text message. I mean, it even calls back to Cat Person ending on a text message from someone else where the narrator is absent. So yeah, I'm curious if you guys read that kind of final text as an actual epiphany, whether the story kind of leads toward that point and that text kind of provides a sense of closure to it, or if perhaps that closure is a little bit more ambiguous. So that's the question I have. I'll post these questions in the Discord, and yeah, that's it for the lectures for this week. I'll see you guys in the Discord, and I'm looking forward to our Zoom discussion on Wednesday. So I hope you're staying safe, and I'll see you in the Discord.